The year was 2004. You could walk into your local Chrysler dealership and your salesman would be happy to present to you with the awe-inspiring Concorde. If you go to the Chevy dealership, they'd be happy to sell you a Cavalier. And God only knows what was going on at Kia. At the same time, Toyota began selling this, what has now become the legendary second-generation Prius. In fact, this is a 2004 model, and my family has owned it since it was brand new. And not only has it survived 18 years of hard use, it has thrived. Now today I'm going to explain to you why I consider the second-generation Prius to be the greatest automotive engineering feat of the 21st century and one of the best cars of all time. Now, I can't really call it the best car of all time because that right is reserved for the Volvo 240. But the second-generation Toyota Prius is definitely one of the best cars ever made. Now, in my opinion, one of the most impressive things about the second-generation Toyota Prius was just how ahead of its time it was when it first came out. The features on this one include smart key, keyless entry, push-button start, navigation, Bluetooth, not to mention most of the controls in the vehicle are controlled with a center touchscreen. Now that's something that began being featured in vehicles in more recent years, but you can't say there were very many that had that feature back in 2004. Now this Prius was also one of the first vehicles to use electronic power steering, something we see in most cars nowadays, but in 2004 it was virtually unheard of. Another impressive thing about this Prius is that it boasts a drag coefficient of 0.26. At the time it was the lowest of any car ever made, not just an affordable family car, but of any car, including supercars. That number has only recently been eclipsed by the mighty Elon Musk with the Tesla Model S, which has a drag coefficient of 0.24. So it took nearly a decade for any other automaker to eclipse the Prius's rating, and that's with a $90,000 car, and it only eclipses that number by 0.02. So it just shows you how much engineering went into the overall shape and design of this Prius way back in the day. Oh, and by the way, you know how so many of these newer cars have like these weird, electronic shift dials and buttons? Well, the Prius had that almost 20 years ago. So it's nothing new, it's just new for other car manufacturers. Although most of the features I just listed are pretty advanced and impressive by any standards, there's one feature that I didn't mention because it deserves its own separate lecture. This feature has only begun appearing on the highest end luxury cars like Teslas, Rolls-Royce, etc. But the Prius had this 20 years ago, and that feature is self-closing doors. Yep. You can't say that about your Mercedes-Benz, can you? All jokes aside, the Prius's advanced features aren't the most impressive thing about this car. You see, when Toyota unveiled this concept, it was nothing like anything the automotive world had ever seen. This car is extremely complex, and the drivetrain is comprised of multiple pieces. You have the internal combustion generator up front, paired to an eCVT transmission. There's also a high voltage battery under the back seat, which drives an electric motor. So you have various components that all come together, not to mention all the other features that I just mentioned. Let's say any car maker came out with a vehicle this complex and this advanced in 2004. They put the vehicle out there and it was a complete failure. They put the vehicle out and it only lasted a few months, maybe a year. It still would have been impressive to pack that many features into a car at that time and make it so complex, and to even put it out to the public would be impressive on its own. But Toyota didn't stop there, because since this car was introduced, it has cemented its legend as being one of the most reliable, durable vehicles ever made. I'm not just talking about it's a reliable hybrid or it's reliable for a car that uses so much technology. No, I'm talking about most reliable of any car, period, right here. In fact, this 2004 Prius is still on its original high voltage battery, and you can tell by some of the body panels around this car, it hasn't exactly had an easy life. And on top of that, there is one guy in the Toyota Prius Facebook club who got 504,000 miles out of his original high voltage battery until he went on vacation for a month. Then when he came back, it died. And what did he do? He wrote to Toyota. They gave him a new OEM high voltage battery at half the price, and he is still driving the vehicle to this day. On our personal vehicle, in its 18 years of loyal service, it has hardly had any problems, and other than regular maintenance, it has just continued to hum along and perform flawlessly. At 100,000 miles, it did need the inverter coolant pump, and at the same period, the combination meter in the dash, which controls the speedometer, shows you the gas gauge, also began working intermittently. So I actually just had that changed out on my road trip here to Arizona. There was a guy at Texas Hybrid Battery, his name is Matt, and he is very knowledgeable about these cars, and he programmed a new combination meter to go in the dash. It's worth mentioning the car is drivable without fixing this issue, but if you want to do things like say, know your speed, or know how much gas you have, or use cruise control, you're going to need to swap out that combo meter. Lastly, I'd like to bring you guys around back to talk a little bit about practicality. Despite being over a foot shorter than Toyota Camry, the Prius has the back seat space of a mid-size sedan and the cargo capacity of a small SUV. And the way that Toyota did this was they designed the vehicle with very short front and rear overhang. And what this did was it really maximized the interior cabin space. So throughout our years of owning this car, we have mainly used it for family outings and going on bike rides and stuff. And on many occasions, we have fit 2 bicycles in the back without an issue. And that's without taking off any wheels on the bikes. And if you did some disassembly, you could probably fit 3 in here. So the Prius is a very practical car on top of all of the other amazing features that it has. Obviously, there's one more thing that we have to talk about anytime that you talk about a Prius, and that is going to be fuel economy. So at 18 years old, with the original hybrid battery, this car easily gets 45 miles per gallon in mixed driving. And actually, primarily, that was on the highway. The Prius actually gets better gas mileage in the city. When you're driving around the city, let's say like Brooklyn, New York City, and you're constantly regenerating with the brakes and hitting the gas, it actually could get over 50 miles per gallon. But so we're talking about 45 miles per gallon on the highway, and that's not like hypermiling or anything. It's not like tailgating a semi-truck at 50 miles an hour in the left lane. No, this is like driving normally like a normal human at 80 miles an hour on big highways with wind and like rough roads kind of. So easily you can get 45 miles per gallon. And while we're in the car, let's talk a little bit about driving the Prius. Oftentimes things come up when people talk about the Prius. No, it's not fast, but it's not slow. Like, it gets the job done. You have no problem merging onto highways. You have no problem keeping up with traffic. Oftentimes when I'm driving around, I notice that people can't keep up with me if you drive it with a heavy foot. Driving a Prius around town is actually a joy. Like, it's a really quiet car. It handles good. The suspension is nice and soft. And overall, I love the way the Prius drives. I am a car enthusiast, so I would be kind of sad if a Prius was my only car, but for people who just use a vehicle to get from point A to point B, and they're not really into cars much, they don't need to row their own gears or drive anything with loud exhaust or something, the Prius is actually like the best car ever, because it's just like, it has no problems, it does its job. It's definitely one of the best used cars. I mean, it's hard to beat a car with this much technology that you could get for $5,000 and it'll go like 500,000 miles without much maintenance, and it also gets 50 miles per gallon. And it would make no sense to buy a Gen 3 Prius for like twice the price if you can get this one to get almost the same gas mileage, and this one will probably last you a whole lot longer. Finally, as it turns out, the 2nd generation Prius was so good that by the time 2010 rolled around and it was time for the 3rd gen Prius, Toyota actually had to de-engineer the car because it made more sense from a business perspective to build cars that were lasting 200,000 miles than cars that were lasting 500,000 miles. And sure, the newer Prius was more powerful, got slightly better gas mileage, but when you drive the two and compare like the interior and the quality of the cars, you can tell that the Gen 3 is definitely a cheaper built car. And my dad actually had a 2010 and we loved it, but just from a pure durability and engineering standpoint, the Gen 2 is definitely the more impressive vehicle. So if you weren't a Prius fan before this video started, maybe you are now, or at least you hate the Prius a little bit less. But if you're still not a fan of the car, that's okay. These things just aren't for everyone. But at least I was able to show you why the second generation Toyota Prius was the greatest automotive feat of the 21st century.